Hello and welcome to the Progress Theory, where we discuss how to implement scientific principles for optimizing human performance. My name is Dr. Phil Price, and on today's episode, we're joined by environmental physiologist and lecturer at Bournemouth University, Dr. Becky Neal. Environmental physiology is such a fascinating topic, and it's really interesting to see how the human body copes and competes in such extreme environments. Exercise in the heat is a common factor which really affects performance, and it's really affected the athletes that have gone over to the Tokyo Olympics, where it was reported to be incredibly hot and humid over there. In this episode, Becky and I discuss how the body physiologically reacts to heat, what can lead to a heat injury or illness, and what strategies you can use to acclimate to the heat and improve your own sporting performance. As always, please follow the Progress Theory on Instagram, YouTube, or on your podcast app of choice. And while you're there, check out all of our other content. Here is Dr. Becky Neal. Hi, Becky. How are we?
Hi, Phil. Yeah, very good. Thanks. How are you?
I'm not too bad. Thank you so much for coming on the Progress Theory. With today's topic, obviously, we were going to talk about exercise in the heat. And I wanted just to introduce this as to where my interest in sort of environmental physiology has come from. It's definitely not my area, but it's an area that is fascinating. I think it's an area that's fascinating for a lot of people because it kind of represents the extremes. I have a book here, which I read quite a few years ago. It might be a little bit outdated. I don't know if you've seen it before.
Yes, I have that one upstairs. Yeah.
Yeah, for those listening and not watching, it's Life at the Extremes, The Science of Survival by Frances Ashcroft, who is a professor of physiology at Oxford. And yeah, she has a chapter on high altitude, high pressure, extreme heat, extreme cold. I think all of these are fascinating because people want to know how the body reacts in the extremes. So I was like, okay, right. Let's talk about heat. And I knew you did a lot of research within exercising in the heat. So I was like, okay, right. I'm going to give you a shout and thank you for coming on to the Progress Theory.
Yeah, my pleasure. That book's great. And like you say, it's got all the different chapters for the different types of environmental stressor. And I think you're interested in one, then suddenly you're interested in all of them. Yeah,
definitely. Exactly that. That's why hopefully I'll be able to have an episode on the Progress Theory on each chapter. But anyways, let's hear about you. Would you be able to give a bit more of an introduction about where your interest in environmental physiology came from?
Yeah, sure. So at the moment, I'm a senior lecturer at Bournemouth Uni, teaching physiology and doing some research as well. But I think I first academically encountered environmental physiology in probably my final year of university. I chose an option to do that. Mostly because I liked mountains, and I liked skiing, and I liked kind of doing things outdoors. I'd been doing sport from when I was really young, and I just liked the outdoors, and I liked extreme things. So I kind of chose one of those things because I liked physiology, and it was like a combination of my favorite things, really. And you touched on those topics there. We did altitude, we did heat, we did diving physiology, hyperbaric as well, and I really, really enjoyed that. And, when you enjoy something, you want to do it more and more. And so I chose to do a master's in something called human and applied physiology. And most of that was also environmental physiology. And we got to do some really cool trips and stuff. We went to the RAF and did aviation medicine. So proper high altitude physiology.
Yeah.
Other cold water immersion trips to Portsmouth near you. And some other heat stuff in the heat chambers and things. So really, we did a lot of that, and I ended up doing my kind of research project in cold water immersion as well. And then I wanted to do even more, so I did a PhD, and that was in heat acclimatisation, again at the labs in Portsmouth. So it just sort of got bigger and bigger.
Yeah. Is that under Professor Tipton?
Yeah, he was my supervisor, along with Joe Corbett and Heather Massey.
Oh, wicked. Okay, yeah, I remember Professor Tipton years ago came to St Mary's and gave I think it was a talk on the dangers of open water swimming, but it wasn't necessarily always the shock of the cold. It was when people all get in and suddenly there's a lot of like splashing around, and how it's like a combination of shock,
Right.
cold, and the fact that something like that, it was such a long time ago, but I remember it being really, really fascinating. So
yeah, I think I've been involved in some of those experiments on autonomic conflict. But yeah, a bit like a triathlon start, it's a bit hectic, isn't it? And there's a lot of things that could go wrong.
yeah, definitely. Would you be able to go into a bit more detail as to what happens to the body in the heat? So yeah, physiologically, what goes on? How do we respond?
So some things happen quickly and some things happen a bit slower. So first of all, you're gonna notice it perceptually. Your skin's gonna get hot. It's on the surface, so your skin's gonna get hot, but it's a bit longer before your core, your deep body temperature gets hotter. So first of all, your skin's hot, and you can feel that like perceptually. So you start feeling a bit hot. Then you have changes to like your heart rate, your cardiovascular kind of responses. So your heart rate goes up in order to get more blood flow to your skin. So that way you can lose more heat if we have more blood, which essentially carries the heat around our body. If it's closer to our skin surface, then we can lose it. We can lose more heat. It's one way that we cool down. So you get kind of more blood flow. So you might see your veins getting bigger, vasodilation, to help lose that heat. And then after that, you'll start sweating. So that happens a bit faster for men, and they also sweat a bit more. And it depends on your body size as well. So you'll start sweating, and that's the most important thing, or that's the thing that's going to lose you the most heat, probably, the evaporation of that sweat. So it's important that you sweat. Some people go into the heat and they're like, oh, like I'm so unfit, or I'm so rubbish in the heat. I get so sweaty. Like I hate this. Let me just get rid of this sweat. But you want to be sweaty, and you want the sweat to evaporate, so you can lose the heat and maintain your body temperature, or it's called thermoregulation. You are thermoregulating to help maintain like a suitable body temperature, or not let it kind of go out of control. So that's kind of like the main responses. There are, more hormonal or hematological and lots of other kind of smaller changes that we don't notice so much.
And is it that as we exercise actually accelerates the processes that you've just described? It isn't like, okay, you respond to heat and then there's separate processes that happen when you start exercising. It's more that exercise accelerates it and exacerbates it.
Yeah, exactly. So you can gain heat from the environment when you're just passively there, from warm air or from radiation from the sun. But also you can generate heat. Your muscles, when you're exercising, we're not very efficient. So some of it is, useful work, and the rest of it is heat that we need to lose. So exercising is going to make us hotter than not exercising. So active rather than passive. And that means you're either going to get hotter faster, or you're going to need to you're going to see these sweating and things set on earlier.
Yeah.
So it kind of increases your core body temperature more so than just sitting in the heat.
Yeah, definitely. Is there a level of temperature or outside temperature where it's seen as like a bit of a danger zone? So, I mean, it's 26 degrees today, and that's probably not seen as a danger zone, despite it being really hot for us Brits. But is there like a level? It's like, okay, this is hot, but anything hot above this can be really quite dangerous.
Yeah, well, it's more of a balance. It's not that clear cut, because there's so many factors that affect it, both environmental and your own physiology. So you could have a cool actual air temperature, but it might be really sunny, no wind. You might be working really, really hard and generating a lot of heat, and you might be at risk of, heat illness more so, or you might be getting hotter than if you were just outside in the shade, but the air temperature was 30 degrees. So it's not really only air temperature. There's lots of factors that come into it: solar radiation, wind, so convective cooling, and what you're doing, and also how good you are at thermoregulating. Some people are going to be better at it than others.
Which factors, when you start combining them, could be quite dangerous? in particular? So like
solar
hot,
radiation
low
can
wind.
be, yeah. So high solar radiation, so like a lot of sun exposure, low winds. If you're moving, like if you're kind of moving through the air, then there's going to be some convective cooling. But you can feel it, can't you? If you're in the heat and you don't have a fan on, you feel hotter than if you just put a fan on your face. That's perceptually it's working, but also it is actually helping to evaporate the sweat off of your skin, especially if there's high humidity, because that's one of the things we struggle with when there's high humidity. The problem is you can't evaporate the sweat that you've produced, so you don't actually lose the heat. You just get dehydrated. So that's why kind of hot and humid is kind of harder to deal with than hot and dry.
Okay. What's the difference between hot and humid?
So if we're talking about the air temperature, we can have a temperature in degrees C. So like in Tokyo this year in the Summer Olympics, it's going to be maybe 30 degrees, but also the humidity might be about 70%. If the humidity was lower, like 30%, it might be more, we might be able to deal with it better because we're much better or easier to kind of evaporate the sweat that we're producing. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
No, that makes sense. It's, you hear hot and you hear, or heat, and you hear humidity said a lot. And you hear about certain places which are, that's high humidity. It's really quite dangerous to exercise there. And Tokyo Olympics being one of them, everyone's talked about the high humidity there, and it could potentially be quite dangerous for the athletes if they don't prepare optimally. So trying to understand the difference between the two, and how actually when you start combining them both together when they're both high, that's the kind of danger zone, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I mean, the UK is actually quite humid, but we don't necessarily think that when you go outside. You think of humidity as like some tropical rainforest, but actually, if you look at the numbers, and it's relative to temperature. Okay, so it's not 70% humidity at 30 degrees isn't the same as 70% humidity at 20 degrees. So it is quite complicated, and this is why people try and practice in an environment that they think they're going to experience, because it is different.
Yeah. And it's these reasons why certain races, I guess, like the Marathon des Sables, running across the Sahara Desert, and maybe the Badwater, that long ultra marathon, which is in Death Valley, is that right?
Yeah,
and it's these conditions where heat and humidity are the highest, and that's what makes them particularly tough races.
Well, the desert's pretty dry, so I think that's why people are actually able to do 5 days across the Sahara, because it's not so humid. And they've got some preparation in place, they've got cooling strategies in place, and there's going to be a lot of solar radiation there, so they're going to get that kind of heat influence, but the humidity isn't so high, so they are able to kind of lose the heat through their thermoregulation, as long as they're able to kind of maintain control of that.
Okay. I never really knew that. And I guess the Badwater might be a little bit different. I've heard that is really like real high humidity there, or I think I should double check. I should double check the climate of Death Valley.
Yeah. So if you're going to go race somewhere hot, check the climate. That's the message. It's gonna have a big influence. And also, if you're going to go somewhere, you want to prepare for the worst case scenario, really. Tokyo might be 30, 31, but also on one day it might be 34. And, that's the minimum that if you're able to heat acclimatise beforehand, that's like sort of the minimum you want to be aiming for. And same with humidity. Yeah.
It's quite a nice segue into what I was thinking of asking next, would be like, how would you prepare the body to do such an event like Tokyo Olympics, like the Badwater, like the Marathon des Sables, when you've got to improve your body's ability to thermoregulate? What kind of strategies could someone use?
Well, there's a few different approaches, mainly influenced by, what you have access to. So, the kind of the ideal scenario would be that you could do some kind of heat acclimatization or heat acclimation. We call it heat acclimation when it's done in the laboratory, acclimatization when it's done in the real world. So that would be ideal, because what you're doing there is actually changing your body. So you're better able to handle it. You can thermoregulate better to lose more heat or store less heat. other options involve, external things or even internal things, but you're not having a change in your physiology, you're just putting something on you. So for example, cooling strategies like ice vests. That's, if you put an ice jacket on, you're going to be able to drag some heat out of your body. The ice is going to cool you down by like conduction, and you're going to get cooler. You're kind of forcing it on your body. You're not actually kind of regulating your body temperature. And also there's there's other things about that aren't really ideal. You might feel a bit sluggish because, you're basically making your skin cold. And when your skin's cold, it does the opposite to when you're hot. So you're actually constricting your blood vessels, and then your body thinks you're cold, and it does the thing to kind of retain more heat. Like some of the responses, you're just stopping the blood flow going to your skin. Well, actually, you want to keep losing heat, but the local mechanisms think that you're actually cold. So you can kind of get a bit sluggish, or if you're actually wearing an ice jacket, for example, then you're covering up your skin, so you can't evaporate sweat from those areas either. So it might seem nice and feel nice, but actually might not be as good as actually kind of thermoregulating differently. Another option would be to do that, but internally. So ice slurries or very cool drinks. That way you can kind of cool down from the inside out a bit, but it's still kind of being forced upon you. So that's good because you can maintain hydration. Yeah, and you can have a nice drink.
The
and you
slurries
can put
sound nicer than the vest.
Definitely, yeah. So the vests are good, if you're not an athlete, if you're in a different situation, maybe you have to wear protective clothing. People who have to go defuse bombs or fight fires or work in kind of suits because there's some kind of infection control or something like that. Those people might actually benefit from wearing an ice jacket because they can't evaporate their sweat anyway because they're in this totally encapsulated environment. So there is definitely ways where it can be useful. But I think if you're an athlete, then maybe an internal mechanism like an ice slurry, because then you can add in some electrolytes, some carbohydrates, and you can kind of make sure you're hydrated as well, because that's going to impair your ability to handle the heat as well if you're dehydrated. There's quite a few other mechanisms as well, like different tools you can use.
Certainly.
Convective cooling, fanning is very good, especially if you're sweaty or wet.
Yeah, just have someone run alongside you with a fan.
Yeah, if you're running though, or if you're cycling, you've already got quite a lot of convective cooling. If you're cycling at 40 kilometers an hour, you've already got that much kind of wind. So adding a bit more fan isn't really going to do much. But if you want to make sure that you're sweating enough to be able to evaporate that. And the sweat consistency is different between people and changes actually with heat acclimatization as well. And that sweat consistency actually helps evaporate the sweat quicker. Better than just water on your skin.
Yeah, definitely. Sounds like there's definitely quite a few strategies you can use. Some may be more logistically challenging than others, and some might be more appropriate for certain events, like bike versus running or something like that. So it's quite nice to have like an overview of all of them, and then you sort of pick and choose what you think's best for what's going to come at you in the event.
Exactly. And, there might be events where you need to have, lots of smaller events. If you're in like the heptathlon or some kind of multi-cycling event or something, you might need to kind of be out for a long time, but then getting hot and cold and doing things in between. Sometimes even just perceptually, we can change. L-menthol actually makes us feel cooler. And, you can have other kind of local cooling mechanisms. But I wouldn't necessarily say that's the way forward, because then you think that you're cooler, but you're actually not. So you're more likely to get hotter because you'll continue working hard, especially in a competitive environment. That's the competition element is actually going to have even more of an influence. And you're probably, if you're a competitive athlete, you're going to override that feeling of knowing you're hot, but actually I want to beat that person just 5 meters in front of me. So I'm going to keep working hard. And we've seen that kind of come to a head in a few races before, including triathlons. So it can be dangerous in a competition scenario. But the best way forward is heat acclimation. Yeah.
Well, actually with that, because say I'm an Olympic athlete, obviously I wish, but and I'm going to somewhere that's very humid like Tokyo.
So you talk about acclimatization versus acclimation. Would you recommend that I do both? Like I should be maybe working for a few weeks in a heat chamber before I then go to Tokyo, and I should go 2 to 3 weeks beforehand so I can then get used to the heat that's there. Is that the best strategy? Because I've seen sort of some companies, they've got a heat chamber and they go, oh, come for a heat chamber, and the athlete goes once. But in my head is thinking we probably need a bit more time in the heat chamber than just one session to actually allow your body to adapt to that.
Yeah. Okay. So there's quite a few sort of nuances to heat acclimation.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's definitely ideal. And you want to be doing it for more than one day. Really in the literature, the best, the optimum amount of time to do it for is sort of 10 days, 2 weeks. By that point, you're going to have adapted all of your different responses. Some things happen really quickly, like your cardiovascular changes quite quickly. So you're going to have a lower heart rate for the same amount of work. So you do the same exercise, your heart rate will be lower. That's a good thing. Then other changes happen. You get an increase in skin blood flow. You get an increase in sweating, but that's a bit slower. That's closer to the 2 week mark. You can't get that kind of change in a few days, really. It takes a bit longer. I did some studies in my PhD comparing 5 days with 10 days heat acclimation to see what difference there was between the responses. And the other thing that you want mainly from heat acclimatization is an expansion in plasma volume. That means you've got more blood, essentially, or more water in your blood as well, which means you have a higher cardiac output and you can actually kind of have a bit more capacity to do more work or handle whatever exercise you're doing a bit better. And that will improve your performance. So heat acclimation does improve VO2 max, lactate threshold, and a lot of other kind of smaller things and different fuel sourcing even. So there are many, many different adaptations that happen. Heat shock proteins increase, and you've got these changes to your blood as well. So really there's a lot of benefits to it, but if you want to do it properly, you need a bit of time and you need those environments as well. Everyone wants to know how you can do it quicker. So there has been quite a lot of research in that, for athletes, but also for people who have to be deployed somewhere hot very quickly. They don't necessarily have a lot of time. So people looked at 5 days, people look at twice daily. Is that as good? If you do 2 lots of 2 per day, so 2 days, twice a day, is that better than once a day for 4 days? So people have looked at that. And, it does work a bit. Some of these changes happen and it's definitely better than not doing it. And actually, a lot of these changes, they don't last forever, but they last a little bit of time. So you can do it kind of before, but the complicated thing with athletes is that, they've got to travel. They've got to get in their taper. They've got to do their good training sessions, and they've got to eat and change time zone and get enough sleep. There's so many other things to take into consideration. But at the end of the day, if you're out there and it's hot and you haven't prepared for it, it's going to affect your performance. Why would you neglect that? You wouldn't neglect what food you were eating. And it always kind of baffles me sometimes, people don't seem to think about it year round. And then suddenly there's a big championship race and it's hot. Whoa, why is everyone surprised? You could have been thinking about this all year round. And I'm sure that a lot of athletes are. I've seen athletes come to the lab all year round and kind of try and prevent things from happening. But a lot of the general public, at least, probably only think about it when suddenly it's hot. The last few days have been hot and we've only really started thinking about it at the moment. Other countries are a bit better. Australia, they're much used to kind of heat waves, and they have a lot of research looking at kind of the population, especially older people who aren't able to regulate in the heat as well. And that can cause quite a lot of issues. So anyway, I've gone on a tangent.
That's perfect.
Yeah, it will last for a little bit. But timing with all the other things has to be considered. Some things you'll lose quite quickly. That the sweat response is gonna be lost kind of within a week, but other things might stay for a month. And it's a lot faster than things like altitude training. Altitude takes a bit longer, but lasts a bit longer as well.
Okay. Do you think heat is sometimes underestimated? The only reason I said that is because I've seen a number of big events, and all of a sudden certain athletes don't do as well, and then they start saying, oh, maybe we didn't prepare for the heat, that we didn't expect the environment to be the way it is on the day. And then you've got a few like scientists on Twitter saying, oh, maybe they just didn't plan ahead enough. And what you've just described, there's so many different factors which you can use or manipulate with the training to try and get a response. And you could probably do it within 5 days, 10 days, double sessions, whatever it might be. But the fact that as some athletes still seem to be getting it wrong, do you think, is there a lack of understanding of how to put it all together in an applied sense, or is it just being underestimated?
I think it is often underestimated, but also people are trying to do it. They are putting in some effort, and maybe there is some lack of understanding. But also, it's just logistically difficult. It's difficult to prepare optimally, especially in the exact conditions that you're going to be racing in. You're never working that hard. You never got the competitive influence, and you don't know exactly what the conditions are going to be on that day. Is it going to be hot but cloudy? Because that's a totally different kettle of fish if you've got no solar radiation. Is it going to be slightly cooler but actually really sunny? And how long am I going to be out for it? And so there are, you can't blame them, but there's definitely things that can be done. And even if you don't have access to those types of things, there are other ways. So we've been talking about active heat acclimation. So when people do these heat acclimatization sessions, they're maybe training 90 minutes in something hot, 40 degrees, 50% humidity, in a heat chamber, nice and controlled. What we use generally in the research at the moment, and what is kind of a good way to go, is something called isothermal strain, or other people call it controlled hypothermia. And that basically means when you're exercising, you're measuring your core body temperature, usually with a rectal thermistor, and you're trying to kind of get to a similar temperature. So you're not measuring the amount of heat coming at you, 40 degrees from the air. Instead, you're measuring how your body is the strain on your body. So normally your core temperature might be 37 degrees, and when we do these heat acclimation sessions, we're more like 38.5. Doesn't sound like that much, but when you're 38.5, generally you're hot, you're sweaty, you're pink, and you can definitely feel it. It's enough. Your skin's hot and your core body temperature is hot, and that's going to stimulate these adaptations. So what we do is we try and get there quite quickly. So we work hard for about half an hour, and then once we're there, we just try and kind of level off and stay at that temperature. And you don't actually need to do as much exercise then. We have a heat chamber, it's 40 degrees, you don't have much wind in there, you might have a little bit of a fan to make them feel more comfortable, but you're not actually kind of cooling them down. So you just kind of regulate the exercise to maintain that core body temperature, to kind of keep that stimulus going. Because as people adapt, after 5 days, they're actually going to have a cooler body temperature, a cooler skin temperature, and they're actually going to be handling that a bit better. So they're going to have to work a bit harder. So instead of, you can change the environment, you can put the temperature up a bit, or you can get people to exercise more. But if you weren't measuring core temperature, then you wouldn't necessarily know that. If you just kept everything the same, the stimulus would be getting weaker, and you wouldn't be kind of maximizing your adaptation. So that was an aside about how you do a heat acclimation. But if you can't do all that, if you don't have all those, nice things to monitor and create the heat, then maybe you can do passive heat acclimation. And you can do that with hot water, or you could do it like a hot bath, or you could do it with a sauna, so hot air. And the best way to do this is after exercise. Because if you're sat in a hot bath or you're sat in a hot sauna, your skin's going to feel hot quite quickly, but it takes a bit longer for your core temperature to be hot. It's not going to be like when you're exercising, like you said at the start. When you're exercising, you're generating a lot of heat, so you get hotter kind of quicker. So if you're just sat in a bath or sat in a sauna, it's not going to be as kind of strong a stimulus as active kind of heat acclimation. But it is going to give you something. And that's something that's probably a bit more accessible, but it's also quite nasty. Like imagine finishing a hard session, you feel really hot, you've gone for a run, and then you get in a 40-degree bath for 40 minutes. Like that's hard enough to handle on just a normal day when you
sounds awful.
So it's not that pleasurable, and but it's one way to kind of to get something. You will get some adaptation from that. It won't be as much as active heat acclimation, but it's going to be useful. But then again, that's not really, you're not really experiencing what you're going to experience in the competition. You're not used to exercising in the heat. So you're still going to have that, in answer to your question, you're still going to have that kind of surprise or expectations not really there. You're going to be kind of shocked still and think, my performance, and things go out the window a bit. So you can be prepared, but also not prepared in the best way.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely sounds like each of the approaches have certain limitations, but doing them still outweighs the fact of not doing any heat training before going to do a very hot race.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely going to be prepared more so. And also, you're prepared. As long as you're not thinking beyond your mean, you're not thinking, a lot of it's placebo as well, but not so much in heat acclimation because it actually will have a direct effect on you. And also you don't want to be kind of overdoing it and thinking you're fine when actually you're not. That's when you end up kind of weaving around the finish line.
That's kind of what I wanted to touch on next, because there was this I think it's famous, but I've seen it lots of times. I think it's the Ironman in Kona, Hawaii, where there was like a sprint finish at the end of it between two people, and they literally couldn't walk, and they sort of like crawling over each other to get to the finish line. And I heard both of them got like very serious heat injuries to the point where one had to have part of their colon removed, something like that, something really bad. I'll have to find it and put it in the show notes. But I wanted to touch on like, what is a heat injury? If this person had part of their insides removed, technically, how does the body get damaged if it's exposed to heat or a situation which it's not accustomed to, and it just takes it that little bit too far?
Yeah, I mean, it is dangerous. Like you say, those videos, there are actually quite a few different ones. I don't know if I've seen that one, but there are lots, and that's the problem. And we see people in mass participation events also succumb to kind of issues like that. So heat illness can have different levels of severity. At first you might just have a bit of a headache. You might be dehydrated, and we class that as a 2% body mass loss. That's when we class you as dehydrated, and that's going to affect your performance. Okay. And that's not really like a heat illness per se, but you might be feeling it, and it might affect your performance. After that, we have things like heat exhaustion. And that's when you can't any longer keep up with regulating your temperature. So it's kind of spiraling out of control. You're getting hotter and hotter. You're sweating, your skin blood flow, your heart rate, all those things are not doing enough to maintain a kind of a constant body temperature. So you're getting hotter and hotter. And eventually you'll get to a point where you collapse. And that's when it can get a bit more dangerous and lead to death in the end. Certainly the difference between some of the things is whether or not someone's hot and sweaty, or if they're dry. If they're dry, they're no longer kind of sweating, which is a bad thing. They're not able to even do that mechanism to help cool them down. And that's a real problem. With anybody that is kind of experiencing a heat illness, you need to get them cool. That's like the main aim. You need to cool them down quickly. And, some of these people that we've seen at the end of events that have, signs of heat illness, they're not necessarily hot. People can be 38.5 degrees and have heat illness, or they can be 41 degrees core temperature and have heat illness. Somebody might be 40 degrees and be fine. So it's not just about what their core temperature is. It's all these other things. And so you need to kind of look at what they're looking like. If they're pink and sweaty, they're probably still doing something to cool them down. But if they're kind of white and dry, and it's probably a bit, it's gone too far, and you need to kind of intervene for them because they're not really able to do much themselves. And you get quite delirious. People don't talk much sense. They can't go in a straight line. And then that can lead to damage, in all parts of your body, really. And some of the things we haven't really talked about the smaller parts of heat acclimation. We have something called thermal tolerance, which is mainly based around the cells of the body. So you're basically, when you're doing heat acclimation or heat exposure of some kind, the cells are getting used to it as well. And their kind of adaptation or response to it may last longer than some of these whole body responses that we've been talking about. So we've done some kind of measuring. We collect some blood samples and measure some hormones in the blood, cortisol, different cytokines, inflammatory markers, heat shock proteins, other kind of fluid regulatory hormones like ADH. And we're trying to work out whether some of those things can be protective in the future. So, say thermal tolerance of the cells. If they've had some exposure to some heat, will they be better at handling that in the future and actually stop some of these more severe heat illness kind of situations?
Yeah. So whenever you think of those physiological responses you want to get from an athlete, especially through training, I guess you do automatically go to those total body responses, but it's those on a cell / molecular level, which are the ones that are supporting the whole body responses. And if they change or are more adaptive before you see anything whole body wise, then you can imagine that's the more important thing to maybe focus on. Maybe a little bit more difficult to focus on, maybe a bit more lab based, but still very important.
Yeah. So you can't really know, and we're trying to work out ways to see if we can see whether somebody is heat acclimated enough through all of those measurements, cellular or whole body. But that's kind of when sometimes people end up, getting heat illness when you don't expect them to, but then you find out later on, or actually they were a bit ill beforehand. So there was other things going on at a cellular, viral infection or something like that. People with fever is a symptom of infection. So you might already have an increase in body temperature. And, sometimes it's not even about something being wrong with you. But, for women, our core body temperature isn't the same all times of the month. In the luteal phase, our core body temperature is actually high already. And people who are on oral contraceptive as well are going to have a higher body temperature. And so we might be more susceptible to some injury. And, we don't sweat as much. We have quite a high skin blood flow. It's why we go pink rather than being as sweaty. But we don't also have as much muscle to generate as much heat. And, there's so many factors in physiology, surface body, surface area of your body to lose heat from, how much kind of is exposed, how well trained you are. So people who are endurance trained are already kind of partially acclimated. Some of those things I mentioned at the start about how you adapt to the heat are actually very similar to how you adapt to just endurance training. So if you already got some of those, then you're probably pretty good at handling it already. People seem pretty veiny, don't they, if they're in endurance training.
Yeah.
So there's, again, a lot of integrating factors.
Yeah, certainly. When it comes to the difference between men and women, because of those limitations you just described, do women respond better to heat acclimation training? Or would you say men respond better to it? Like they probably both get to the same level. One might respond better to the training initially than the other.
It's difficult to know. There's not really enough research. Jessica Mee has done some papers on this. I'm pretty sure it's slower for women to adapt. The reason we don't really know is just because researchers have avoided it because if you're doing a heat acclimation study that takes weeks, and we want to know, has core body temperature changed? You want to start with a nice baseline. You want to have a nice consistent baseline, and that's easy in men, but in women it doesn't stay the same. It changes. So it's hard to kind of determine the differences, but it should be done, and Jessica's had a good go at it. And it's slower, actually. It's harder, but it's, we can still heat acclimate, yeah.
So the researchers in this area is starting to come out, it's starting to be investigated, and we should know a bit more.
Yeah, I think it's still quite slow, and maybe I should do something. We definitely need to know more, because all of the papers, all the things we're taking the information from is healthy, young men, probably not actual elite athletes, but just well-trained men of 70 kilograms-ish, yeah.
University students, that's obviously a big
we try and
population for studies.
I know in my research I tried to find the most well-trained, but they definitely were still men, so it's tricky.
Yeah. After everything we've just spoken to, being a racer yourself and a very good runner, would you do the marathon des Sables or would you do the Badwater? Would they be something you still want to do yourself?
Oh yeah, I definitely would like to. And there's other researchers in heat acclimation that have done it. Jodie,
okay.
she's done it. That's good. I think sometimes I've gone past that naive state. So, when I'm running a race, I'm either thinking about the physiology or how hot or cool I am. Even when we go into our cold water dips in part of our races as well, I'm thinking about cold water shock and how cold I'm getting. But it is useful. We see people these days in marathon events and things wearing hats with phase change material, and people probably don't notice, but they've got like basically ice in their hats to help cool them down, and they're changing them, during the race to help keep them cool. So those things that if you know how to deal with heat or how to kind of use things, then you can actually kind of probably improve your performance. So having the knowledge is definitely useful. And avoiding heat illness is always good. But yeah, I think I definitely do want to do some more extreme events. Yeah.
Push yourself that little bit further. The extreme ones are the ones that they just look horrible. There's something about long distance in the heat just seems like it's just so you can say you've done them.
No, you
check out Phil. He's done this, and this. But something about the long distance marathon des Sables just looks. Is that just attainable for me?
It does. Yeah, and I've done like some work acclimating people before they go there. So they come to the heat chamber and do some sessions with us before they go, and they come back with all the photos. And I'm like, oh, one day. But I haven't taken these steps to doing it. So
I think Hayley, my wife, looked into it.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
A lot of people do that one now. I know Spencer from Made in Chelsea is doing it this year. A lot of people are doing it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Ben Fogel, I think he's done it.
Yeah.
I think it's just a number of people. So it just makes you think, oh, we've got to do it now as well, haven't we?
I know. But we'll do a harder one, Phil.
The Badwater may be even worse, I don't know. Ooh.
Yeah.
Anyways,
I quite fancy an adventure race. Yeah.
Yes. The one Hayley and I were supposed to do the adventure race in Scotland. Obviously not a very, very hot race, but that unfortunately it was cancelled because of COVID.
I was just going to say, following the news from out in China last month, sadly a lot of people got caught in bad weather. So it doesn't have to be heat to make it extreme. We've got altitude, of course, but also just cold, rain, weather can have a profound effect. Yeah.
See, this is why environmental phys is so fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, we've just spent 40 minutes discussing one factor which can be really quite dangerous and you need to take into account. But there's like a million other ones you've got to take into account as well.
Don't get me started on diving or space.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for being on the Progress Theory. We always ask our guests this one question, and that is, if you could choose a guest to be on the show, who would you choose? And it doesn't necessarily have to be in the environmental phys field. It could be anyone. But yeah, who would you want to listen to?
Oh, that's really tough. I think I'd like to hear somebody like Chrissy Wellington. Someone who's achieved some really impressive performances, especially a female, and just seems very, very determined. It's quite interesting to hear the mindset of athletes like that. Yeah,
and mindset must be such a big thing when it comes to events in the heat, because that must be a variable that must be really like pressuring you to stop.
Yeah, well, my colleagues did a paper looking at the effect of competition on the behaviour and thermoregulation, and it totally overrides everything physiology. So it's pretty dangerous. It's quite a cool study. They had an avatar that you were racing, but you thought it was somebody else, but it was actually your past performance, to see how that would affect people.
Oh, that's wicked! I've got to check that out.
Corbett et al.
Wow, Corbett et al. Well, I'll check it out. Maybe put that in the show notes as well. Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much, Becky.
You're welcome.
And hopefully we'll see you at probably a Spartan or a Tough Mudder in the future.